I rise today not only to debate the text of Bill 1, but to speak to the constitutional and moral foundations of this province. I want to add to the comments that my fabulous colleague from Calgary, Buller McCall, already spoken to, and what this Premier herself has just admitted, namely how this province has put together a make-work piece of legislation that does nothing, because this province already has the jurisdiction to do what this bill purports to do. But I digress. We are wasting time in this chamber for nothing else but to appease the Premier's base, nothing else. I rise today because the Assembly has refused to include the amendment I proposed, a simple, clear, lawful amendment that would ensure, quote, nothing in this Act shall be interpreted as abrogating or derogating from the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, end quote. And my colleague from Calgary, Buller McCall, stated, this should not have been controversial. This should not have been debatable. This is the baseline that is required to honour treaty, the Constitution and the honour of the Crown, and yet this government refused. So I speak plainly to this House, to the record and to history, because the decision to reject this amendment is not procedural. It is the refusal to affirm treaty as the foundation of this province. Right. Treaty is the foundation of Alberta. Before there was an Alberta, our nations existed here with law, governance, diplomacy, political systems, peacemaking systems, and systems of accountability. Treaties were not land surrenders. They were agreements to share the land in peace as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. Distinguished Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs writes, treaties are not relics, they are relationships. They require renewal as the river renews itself, through movement, respect, and returning again and again to the teachings of how we are meant to live with one another. And he reminds us of how our laws live on this land, in our stories and in our responsibilities to one another. Treaty is not a moment, it's a practice. Treaty is not historical, it's living. And this was recognized not only by the Indigenous law, but also by Crown law. And as Lord Denning of the High Court of the United Kingdom stated in 1982, no Parliament shall do anything to lessen the worth of these guarantees. This should be honoured by the Crown as long as the sun rises and the rivers flow. This promise must be never broken. This means that no provincial government, including this one, has the authority to weaken, diminish, or ignore treaty. It is beyond their jurisdiction to do so. And ironically, this government already affirmed this last year. Here's what makes this moment so striking. Last year, the same government amended the referendum to act on and add a non-derogation clause protecting treaty rights. The minister said, and I quote from Hansard, "We recognize the importance of protecting treaty rights, which is why we're proposing this amendment," end quote. But in spring of this year, we recognize that treaty rights no longer require explicit protection, but later in the fall, the protection is refused. It's not consistent, it's not principled. This is a political choice to retreat from the treaty relationship. And when political choice overrides constitutional duty, that is where the honour of the Crown collapses. Treaty rights are recognized in the Constitution under Section 35. Section 35 of 1982 affirms that treaty rights are recognized and protected. Recognized means they exist independently of government approval. Protected means they cannot be diminished through silence, neglect, or legislative omission. The Supreme Court of Canada and Delgamuukw affirmed that Indigenous law and the oral history are equal in evidentiary weight to written colonial documentation. This means treaty is defined by both nations and not unilaterally by the Crown. Later on in the Mikisew, the SCC identified that this province, our province, has legal notice of the importance of the Crown's responsibility to the First Nations of Alberta. Further, the Library of Parliament, researchers Sarah Fryer and Olivier LeBlanc-Landure write, both federal and provincial governments share responsibility of upholding treaties. And this obligation is rooted in the honor of the Crown. The responsibility lies here, right here in this chamber. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is not optional. It's a framework for reconciliation. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action number 43 states explicitly, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as the framework for reconciliation. Because this declaration affirms that treaties are matters of international concern. Treaties are the basis of partnership, not policy. Free, prior, informed consent is required before laws affecting Indigenous peoples are passed. States must honor and enforce treaties. And by rejecting my amendment, this government is rejecting the framework for reconciliation. The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as OAS, also states Indigenous people have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, and have states honor and respect same. Quote, and further, nothing in the Declaration may be interpreted, diminished, or eliminated by the rights of Indigenous peoples contained in treaties. This Assembly does not have the authority to diminish or ignore treaty rights. International law does not permit it. Treaty cannot be unilaterally withdrawn from. And this is where I turn to the work of Professor Lawrence R. Heffler, one of the world's leading scholars on treaty law. His article, Terminating Treaties, remains foundational. He says foundational treaties, those that establish political relationships, jurisdiction, and shared obligation, cannot be unilaterally exited from. Withdrawal would destabilize the very legal order that treaty creates. Meaning, if a province acts to undermine treaty, it undermines its very own legal authority to exist on these lands. Without treaty, there is no lawful Alberta. Without treaty, Crown jurisdiction dissolves. So I'll say it very clearly, Mr. Speaker. If you weaken treaty, you weaken yourselves. I had the privilege of spending many years studying and working as a research assistant to the brilliant legal scholar Val Napoleon, who received many international awards on her work, including the Governor General's Award for her dissertation on Gitxsan law. Napoleon writes that Indigenous law is not culture. Indigenous law is law with precedents, accountability, legitimacy, and interpretive standards. She explains simply, when treaty is dishonored, it's not only Indigenous law that is violated, it is also Canadian law, because treaty is the bridge between the two. She also writes, to treat Indigenous law as symbolic while recognizing Canadian law or provincial law as authoritative is to reduce the very colonial hierarchy that treaty was meant to resolve. Treaty is the space of shared legal order, where neither legal system is subordinate to the other. Our legal pluralism in this country and in this province is what allows for all of us to coexist on these lands. A dear friend and mentor, Michael Ash, wrote the book, We Are All Treaty People. He is a respected anthropologist in academia, and often the courts in this country draw on his work. He writes, treaties are not agreements in which Indigenous peoples consented to be governed. They were agreements in which settlers consented to live as guests with responsibilities to the hosts. He further states, if we take treaties seriously, then Canada is not a colonial state. It is a treaty partnership. And that means that we are to uphold treaty, not merely just benefit from it. I would suggest that we must reflect upon those words about partnership. The consequences of denial of recognitions are felt very deeply in our community. When treaty is ignored, It translates to lived realities where our children are seized faster into foster care, our women and girls continue to go missing and are murdered, our youth age out of systems that fail them, and more often than not, they find themselves incarcerated. And again, we feel some of the highest rates in the country of institutions and jails alike. First Nations are always continuously fighting for their people, for their health care, in their own homelands. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice demands that governments must dismantle structures that normalize violence. Indigenous girls, Indigenous rights to culture and legal systems must be protected. Omitting protection is also violence. You cannot say you care about missing Indigenous women while refusing to honor treaty. You cannot say the words reconciliation while rejecting the framework for reconciliation. It is simply a contradiction that violates our very existence. When I was a young girl, I used to ask elders, why don't we just burn the treaties? They're not upholding their end of the obligation, and we always do, and we suffer for it. And I was taught very firmly, as Indigenous, as Nahel people, we are kind, and that treaty is sacred. It was made with the pipe. It's a covenant between our people and the Creator. Tobacco was offered, songs were sang, nations witnessed, land witnessed, and we agreed to coexist in peace and friendship as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. And this is law. The land remembers, the rivers remember, the ancestors remember. And we carry that memory in our DNA and in this address. So I'll speak plainly. You do not get to undo treaty. You do not get to diminish it. You do not get to have it as an omission. You cannot legislate treaty away. Treaty is far older than this assembly, older than our province, and older than any political ideology. We as First Nations are still here, we have been here, and we will always be here. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, we will continue to work to uphold treaty, with or without the cooperation of this UCP government. Hi, hi.